Golden State Media Concepts bring you Book Review Podcast, a haven for bookworms of all ages and the widest genres, from mystery to memoirs, romance to comedy, fantasy to sci-fi. If you love to read, this is a podcast for you. It's the Golden State Media Concepts Book Review Podcast.
Hello and welcome to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I am your host, Sarah. I am happy, as always, to be with you for another episode of this podcast. I hope you are having a good week. Hope your weekend was great. I am trying to remember. Isn't it terrible when, you go back and try to remember what you did on a weekend and suddenly your mind goes completely blank? What did I do over the weekend? That's an excellent question, and I do not know what I did. How crazy is it? I guess it was just a pretty quiet weekend. If you celebrated Father's Day, I hope you had a good day, whatever that means for you in terms of father figures in your life. It was not the easiest day for me, being the first Father's Day after my dad's death, but we did a family FaceTime call or Portal call, Zoom call, we used Portal, but whatever way makes the most sense to you to know what we did in terms of actually seeing each other on a video call. So my mom, my brother, my sister, and all 5 of my nieces were on that call, which was great. And we shared stories of my dad and talked about some things that some of us had forgotten in terms of, just my dad's quirks and personality traits and everything. So that was really fun and very helpful to make the day a little easier, a little harder in some ways also, but very, very special. So I'm really grateful that I have a wonderful family like I do, and that I grew up with a wonderful dad, but also that there are many men in my life who have played a father-type role. I've been very blessed to have a lot of stand-in parents in my life, mothers and fathers, whether those are family friends or my friends' parents, those sorts of things. I hope that you have had those things as well, whether that's biological family or chosen family, however that works for you. I hope that you've had those wonderful people in your life. So let's talk about books. Let's talk about a book, but it is part of a series, so books. Today I am talking to author Timothy Miller about his book, The Strange Case of the Dutch Painter. This is actually the first in a series. This is the second in a series. I apologize. The first one is called The Strange Case of Eliza Doolittle, and he's working on a third one. So they're all The Strange Case. They all involve Sherlock Holmes. Let me read you the back of the book for The Strange Case of the Dutch Painter. Paris, 1890. When Sherlock Holmes finds himself chasing an art dealer through the streets of Paris, he's certain he's smoked out one of the principals of a cunning forgery ring responsible for the theft of some of the Louvre's greatest masterpieces. But for once, Holmes is dead wrong. He doesn't know that the dealer, Theo Van Gogh, is rushing to the side of his brother who lies dying of a gunshot wound in Auvergne. He doesn't know that the dealer's brother is a penniless misfit artist named Vincent, known to a few and mourned by even fewer. Officialdom pronounces the death a suicide, but a few minutes at the scene convinces Holmes it was murder, and he's bulldog determined to discover why a penniless painter who harmed no one had to be killed, and who killed him. Who could profit from Vincent's death? How is the murder entwined with his own forgery investigation? Holmes must retrace the last months of Vincent's life, testing his mettle against men like the brutal Paul Gauguin and the secretive Toulouse-Lautrec, all the while searching for the girl Olympia, whom Vincent named with his dying breath. She can provide the truth, but can anyone provide the proof? From the madhouse of Saint Remy to the rooftops of Paris, Holmes hunts a killer, while the killer hunts him. So again, that is the description of The Strange Case of the Dutch Painter by Timothy Miller. It is historical fiction. It is a mystery. Of course, it has Sherlock Holmes. No Watson. There is a different sort of sidekick. His name is Dr. Lermaleef, although that is not his real name. That is what Holmes refers to him as in kind of a weird buddy adventure kind of nickname sort of way, but it is told from Lerma Leaf's perspective. So it's not told from Holmes' perspective. We're getting the story from Lerma Leaf and getting some insights into Holmes's character from Lerma Leaf's perspective, because Lerma Leaf thinks he's a little bit off his rocker, and so he's not quite sure what he thinks about working with Sherlock Holmes. He's doing a favor for someone else. So you definitely get some quirky character insights into Holmes from Lerma Leaf instead of Watson. So let's go ahead and turn our attention to the actual interview so you can hear things from Timothy's perspective, why he wanted to write with Holmes as a character, why he chose Vincent van Gogh, historical mysteries, etc. So let's go ahead and turn now to that interview. Again, the book is called The Strange Case of the Dutch Painter. The author is Timothy Miller. Hi, Timothy. Welcome to the podcast.
Hi, glad to be here.
I'm glad to have you here to talk about your book. It's called The Strange Case of the Dutch Painter, and we're going to get to that. But before we get to the book itself, if you wouldn't mind sharing a little bit about yourself, that would be wonderful.
Well, I've always been a writer since I was 6 years old and learned how to print. I started my first novel then. Didn't finish it, but I got about 10 pages in, which is pretty good for 6 years old. But I did not major in English. As a matter of fact, I considered English majors kind of snobs. I majored in theater, and that's helped me a lot, actually, in terms of being able to picture what I write. But so I went through a long process where I wrote poetry, and then I wrote stories, and then I wrote screenplays, and then I finally said, now maybe I could be ready for a novel. And this is actually my second novel, second Sherlock Holmes novel. I find that whenever I have questions, I just go to Sherlock, and he can usually work things out for me, because he's a great deal more logical than I am.
Sure. So it's kind of like, what would Sherlock do?
Yes.
Yes.
Very much is. Or what would he think anyway?
Exactly. Now, I've had a lot of authors on the podcast tell me that they started writing at a young age, but I've never had anyone tell me that they started writing a novel at the age of 6. That is impressive.
Yes. It was about my toy monsters, and my best chapter, they were going on a picnic. So they were not your usual scary monsters.
Right. Oh, I love it. Do you still have it?
I don't know, to tell you the truth.
Okay.
I would have to go through a lot of paper to figure it out.
Well, sure. But the fact that you remember what it was about, that's good enough.
Yeah, so I'm probably not going to finish it. I'm pretty sure about that.
Well, let's do the podcast on that novel. No, I'm kidding. Let's do the podcast on your newer novel. Again, it's The Strange Case of the Dutch Painter. Can you give a synopsis of the story?
Basically, in the simplest terms, it's Sherlock Holmes investigates the murder of Vincent van Gogh, which I figured, Van Gogh has always been presented and was presented to me. I mean, what I knew about Van Gogh when I started this, and I started this years ago, was that Van Gogh was a genius. He was crazy. He cut off his ear to give to his lady love, who was a hooker in Arles, and he shot himself.
Mm-hmm.
And I sat there. Actually, I was looking at a picture in a card store that was one of the pictures of one of his self-portraits. And I thought to myself, well, now, if he really wanted to impress her, he's an artist. Why didn't he give up an eye for her? And then I thought, well, was he really crazy? And that's when I started researching, because I said, is he really crazy? Did he really cut off his ear? Did he really kill himself? And I traced it back, and obviously I do not have the answers to that, but I do have some answers to that. I have plausible answers to that. And plausibility is all I need with historical fiction. I mean, I will do my best to get facts as much as I can, but wherever there's gray area, that's where I mine.
Let's go ahead and take our first break of the podcast, but I do want to say that Timothy's brain sounds like a very interesting place, full of lots of questions. I mean, we all ask questions in different ways, but, what would Sherlock do? I think is an interesting way of answering them. It never really crossed my mind as to what would Sherlock do. I would also like to say that Timothy said he came to listening to Sherlock Holmes later in his life, and he said he was like 21, or reading Sherlock Holmes, not listening. I still have not read Sherlock Holmes. In fact, after this interview, I went and found audiobooks read by Stephen Fry, whom I love, and I'm going to finally get around to reading/listening to Sherlock Holmes. Yes, I'm embarrassed, but I've never done it before now. Let's go ahead and take that break. When we come back, we will be talking more about mysteries, answering questions as though they're being answered by Sherlock Holmes, etc. Stay tuned. You're listening to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I'll be right back.
The GSMC Life and Happiness Podcast takes you on a journey of exploration. We'll discuss tried and true methods alongside the latest trends of how to best live your life to its fullest and happiest. From psychology to meditation, science to self-help books, the GSMC Life and Happiness Podcast will help you to discover what makes you happy and how you can live life being the best you possible. Download the GSMC Life and Happiness Podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you find podcasts. Just type GSMC in the search bar.
Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast. I am speaking today with author Timothy Miller. We are talking about historical mysteries and art, Vincent van Gogh, Sherlock Holmes. So let's go ahead and return to the interview. Okay, so you have a mystery that you're looking to solve, or have your characters solve. Why Sherlock Holmes?
Well, exactly. I had read, I actually read Sherlock Holmes much later than most people. I read Sherlock Holmes when I was about 21. I was not interested in mystery. I was not interested in Sherlock Holmes. And I was living in Houston at the time with a roommate. And it was a gray, rainy weekend. And he happened to have the complete Sherlock Holmes. And so I said, all right, I'll try it. I got nothing else to do. And by the end of the weekend, I had finished the complete Sherlock Holmes, and I was hooked. So now anytime I have a question, and I always have questions because I always look at things kind of cockeyed, I said, let me bring in Holmes and see what he can make of this. Now, this was so long ago, actually, when I first got the idea for this, that at the time Sherlock Holmes was still locked up by the estate. So when I actually wrote this first as a screenplay, I could do nothing with it because it was illegal to do anything with it. So I let it stew for several years. Mm-hmm. But I always knew that I wanted Holmes for this, especially because I had read a short article by a man named Carlo Ginzburg about Sherlock Holmes and Giovanni Morelli. And Giovanni Morelli is not known by a whole lot of people, but he was the original Sherlock Holmes of paintings. And very much, worked in the same style and worked from the same ideas as Holmes did, trying to find the proper clues and to have enough imagination to say whether a certain painting was a forgery or real, or who it should be attributed to. And he really set the art world on its ear, because the art world had not been using science to decide who had created these paintings. So I wanted to do that, to pair these people up. Now, I did not use Morelli. I actually used one of his acolytes because of the age difference. But I saw that as being a tribute to the 7% Solution by Nicholas Myers, which was my first Holmes pastiche, where Holmes works with Sigmund Freud. And I thought, well, Morelli is like a Sigmund Freud or a Sherlock Holmes of painting. And so if I want to investigate the death of a painter, I should have him alongside rather than Watson. So that's how I came with that.
Yeah, and so obviously, if you kind of approach questions with what would Sherlock Holmes think about this, he kind of lives in your head, maybe as a voice. But what was it like to then write a character that is known by many, maybe beloved by many? Was that daunting, or did it seem natural to you?
Well, this is my second Sherlock Holmes novel, although it was my first screenplay, as I said. But I was very much comfortable and very much wanted to have someone besides Watson this time, so that we could explore Holmes from a different angle and see him with new eyes. Because I think that the allure of Sherlock Holmes is in his mystery. And Watson's chief job is to protect Sherlock Holmes from us, so that he can become a mystery and stay a mystery to us, as long as he's filtered through Watson or through, in this case, Yvonne Lermerleaf, whose name is not actually Yvonne Lermerleaf, but is in this story.
Right. And so it's you still have that bit of mystery surrounding Holmes, because it's not told from his perspective, it's told from Lermerleaf's perspective. Can you talk a little bit more about him as the character, and what about him might resonate with readers?
Well, I think first of all, he's halfway between Holmes and Watson, because he is definitely the person that we see the action through his eyes, but he's also very much like Holmes in his own field, in the art field. He's the one who is looking at paintings and deciding whether they're forgeries or not. And in this story, the forgeries are important, because if you go back to Vincent van Gogh and you say, okay, Van Gogh didn't commit suicide, then how did Van Gogh die? Well, he must have been murdered. Well, why would anybody murder Vincent van Gogh? He didn't have a penny. He never he sold one painting during his lifetime. And he was generally well liked, although he was cranky and definitely not the easiest person to get along with. He was very well liked. So why could he have been murdered? I said, well, he must have been murdered because he knew something. And what he knew about was the forgeries. And that's as far as I'm going to go with that.
Yeah, you don't want to give too much away. Obviously, it's a mystery. People need to read it. So in terms of research, obviously, well, to just talk about the research that you did for the book.
Well, the research, I hang out on Twitter with a bunch of people who write fantasy novels and are constantly talking about world building. Well, when you're doing historical fiction, you're not only world building, but you can be checked on it. Somebody can sit there and say, no, that didn't happen in 1890.
Right,
they didn't
right.
have this kind of phone or whatever. And so you have to check everything. I mean, I had to get train schedules for 1890 so that he could figure out how far it is to Orel and how many hours it takes to Montpellier, and so on and so forth. And I had to find restaurant menus for various restaurants in Paris. And I had to investigate forgeries. How do you actually forge a painting? Luckily, I came across a very famous forger, Eric Hebhorn, who wrote a book about how to forge a painting. And of course, I had to research every one of my characters. Almost all of my characters are real, including the villain. So, there's a very large cast. And of course, you find things that you would sure like to be able to put into your story. Like Suzanne Valadon actually became a very well-respected painter herself. Or Louis Anquetin was probably the finest of the Impressionist painters, but he decided to go back to traditional painting and was never heard of again. But you can't fit everything into it. But you do have to build a world. And there's really not an area that I didn't research. Although I admit some people do actually research the weather. I've made up the weather. I'll admit that.
I think we can probably forgive you for that. I can only imagine that whenever I talk to people who write historical fiction, just the amount of research that goes in it. If you put in everything that you learned during the course of your research, you could potentially have like 1,000-page novel, I would think.
Oh yeah, definitely. I mean, it wouldn't hold together,
right?
But it would still be interesting, at least to me.
Yeah. We're going to take our second break of the podcast, and we're going to talk a little bit more about this research and include what you include in terms of all the research you do when we come back. It's got to be painful sometimes, I think, for authors who have all of this knowledge and you can't include everything that you research in the book that you're writing. It just seems like so many good things to share. Like you're listening to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I'll be right back.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast. I am speaking with author Timothy Miller. We were just talking about research and all of the fascinating things you find out during the research process. So let's go ahead and return to the interview with Timothy. Yeah, for me personally, I know that I would have to have many stern conversations with myself, because I'd be like, yes, but I researched this and it's interesting. But then the other voice in my head would say, yes, but it doesn't further the plot.
Yes. Thing I'm working on right now, I desperately wanted to get one historical person into the story and just couldn't do it. And it still hurts. A brilliant book about her. Yeah. But that's the way it is.
Yes. In terms of character development, do you like to do, well, it's a little different with historical fiction maybe because you have characters that existed, but how do you come at character development? Do you tend to have a character sketch before you start? Does that character evolve as you write? How does that work for you?
Very much evolves as I write. For instance, with Lerma-Leaf, I had no idea when he started that he was going to be such a foodie, and that just came out of nowhere. And I said, "Oh, okay, that works," And basically, the characters take shape, and I mean, obviously, with real characters, I mean, you can't make Toulouse-Lautrec a tall guy. But you do have a lot of leeway with them and with their interactions. What I do, maybe because I tended bar for 25 years, is I listen. And at first it's like I'm across the room and I just pick something up and I write that down. And then I kind of ease on over so I can hear a little bit more and a little bit more. And the conversation finally comes into focus. And the people finally come into focus. And I can see exactly how they interact. And if things are working, then they'll support each other in various ways. But I never really started out knowing a character entirely, which is probably why Sherlock Holmes interests me, because he's an inexhaustible character. Mm-hmm.
Okay. What is it about historical fiction do you think draws you to writing within that genre?
First of all, I mean, I wouldn't like to live in Victorian England, but it's very attractive. The whole idea of those streets, fog-covered streets of London, with the carriages rolling by and people behind doors doing things completely different in completely different ways from the way we do now, and seeing things in completely different ways from the way we do now. Makes me itch to get under their skin, and it's almost as if I'm dealing with aliens. And I have to say, well, what was it like to live in Victorian England? And what was it like to pass from Victorian England to Edwardian England when you had been so settled in a particular way of life? I mean, Sherlock Holmes can tell what sort of occupation a man has from basic physical traits and clothing, but that's all because time was suspended during the Victorian era. So what happens when he's in the Edwardian era, and he's in he is in the thing I'm working on right now in 1923, when things are changing? Can he still survive in that kind of atmosphere?
Yeah, interesting. It's almost a bit of a mystery within itself. It's not exactly a mystery, but it's discovering what it was like, what it would be like to live during those times.
Oh yes.
Yeah. The first book is called The Strange Case of Eliza Doolittle. Is that correct?
Yes.
Yes. Can you talk a little bit about that one?
Yes, that one was a little bit different in that almost everybody was a fictional character. It's has, of course, Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson, but it also has Eliza Doolittle and Henry Higgins from
My Fair Lady.
From the music. Yes, from My Fair Lady. And it also has Mr. Hyde. So it's an interesting mix of characters because the question is, how did Eliza Doolittle make this incredible transformation? Was it really all just teaching phonetics, or could she possibly be a different woman entirely? And if so, then why was one switched for the other? And Sherlock Holmes is brought in to investigate this very problem. And again, he was brought in by me to investigate this very problem because I was wondering, the same thing.
Right.
How did she change so completely?
Yeah.
And then I thought about changes, and I thought about Hyde and the incredible changes that he makes. Mm-hmm. This really was my whole concern with, the changes that appeared in Edwardian times from Victorian times. So it's got a little bit of everybody in it. I even have Bertie Wooster in there in a cameo appearance. He's anonymous because he's still under wraps, but I enjoyed that very much.
Interesting. That sounds fun. You've mentioned that you're working on something new now. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yes, this is the third Sherlock Holmes novel. And it's a little different in that, of course, Arthur Conan Doyle, toward the end of his life, became very much interested in spiritualism and was actually one of the people who promulgated the whole idea of Tutankhamun's curse. Well, in my book, that's Sherlock Holmes that promulgates this. Sherlock Holmes, who has changed into a spiritualist. and Sherlock Holmes, who is hired to find out about the murders or the deaths of 5 people who are supposedly victims of the curse of Tutankhamun. And he takes along Watson, who doesn't believe in spiritualism at all, and he takes along a spiritualist medium whose name was Estelle Roberts. She was an actual medium. And they go to Luxor, Egypt, to investigate this. And let's see, how much else do I want to tell you about that? Well, what else would you like to know about that?
Well, I don't, it's a work in progress. So if you want to leave it at that, that's good, because that kind of just, it's like the elevator pitch that gives us just enough to make us intrigued.
Well, it's definitely Sherlock Holmes investigates the curse of Tutankhamun.
Right. And is that, I assume it'll be the strange case of, is that the strange case of
Yes.
Tutankhamun's curse, or do you have a name for it yet?
The strange case of the Pharaoh's heart. Actually.
Okay. Nice.
And it's amazing the weird facts about Tutankhamun that few people realize.
Oh, I bet.
And I won't even go into them, but I pick on just about every one of them for my denouement.
Okay. Time for the final break of the podcast. When we come back, we will find out just how many books might potentially be in the series, the Strange Case series. Stay tuned. You're listening to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I'll be right back.
The Golden State Media Concepts Travel Podcast, the show that gives you advice on everything travel. We explore places you've always wanted to go, as well as giving tips for traveling in those places. We'll give you advice on the best sites for travel tips, information, and discounts. Join us as we travel the world, explore cultures, and meet new people. The Golden State Media Concepts Travel Podcast has got you covered. Download the GSMC Travel Podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you find podcasts. Just type GSMC in the search bar.
Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast and the conclusion of my interview with author Timothy Miller. In terms of the series, so you've got 2 already out, and then you're working on the 3rd one. Do you have kind of an arc in mind, or are you just going to continue writing them as mysteries occur to you?
I think that next, what I'm going to do is go off the wagon a little bit. I think what I'm interested in doing is sort of a Chandler meets Pirandello story, a hard-boiled detective story about a writer who's being pursued by his creations, and they want to murder him.
All right.
And so it's a apparently.
Interesting. Yeah. That would be concerning as a writer. So
yes, especially of course he's killed their loved ones in his books.
Okay.
So they're out for revenge.
Sure. Makes sense. You've written since you were 6, and you've written in a variety of different capacities throughout your career. What made you finally decide to write for publication?
Well, I've just felt that I was ready, and when I was actually writing 2 books at one time, and finally decided I was going to go with the Sherlock Holmes book because that seemed more interesting to me. And I could tell that I had found my voice, or at least I had found Watson's voice, and I was channeling it, and it felt really good to channel his voice. So I decided then, and I mean, I had published a few poems long ago, and I had tried long ago to get a really awful novel published, which thank God it was not published, because I would hang my head in shame. I'm glad there was no such thing as self-publishing at that time. So I put it out there, and it got picked up.
All right.
And I had not intended to make a trilogy out of it, but somehow they just grew out of one another.
Mm-hmm. From your own experience, then, do you have advice for aspiring authors or even aspiring writers of any ilk?
Sit down and write. And it doesn't matter what you write. It doesn't matter if you just write your own name over and over again, because then you will get bored and you will start writing something else. And that way there's never any such thing as writer's block, because you can always write something. And just like any other muscle, your writing muscle will improve. It's just the same as learning to play the guitar, just the same as learning to ride a bike. It's all muscle memory. If I had to think about what I write most of the time, I would be dead in the water. But I can always write and rewrite until it gets better. But you can't worry about bad days. Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, I write garbage, and Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday, I'm a genius. So you just have to keep at it.
Mm-hmm.
And I know they've heard that before, but it's so true.
Yeah, well, it bears repeating sometimes. When you take time to read for yourself rather than for research, who are your go-to authors or genres?
What I really like is magical realism. More than anything else, I love Italo Calvino. I love Borges. I really search for those, and they're difficult to find, because even though there's a lot of magical realism now, there's a lot of it that's bad now, that just doesn't quite click. But for instance, I just came across the Night Circus, which is a fabulous book.
Mm-hmm.
And is both fantasy and magical realism. And I try to put a little bit of magic in everything I write. I also like very much like Charles Dickens, Alexander Dumas. I mean, writers from that period. I would love to try to figure out the mystery of Edwin Drood, just like every other Dickens fanatic.
Mm-hmm. All right. Well, thank you. In terms of internet presence, tell people where they can find you, website, if you're active on any social media, those sorts of things.
I'm active on Twitter, Timothy Miller, and I'm active on Facebook as well. And my website is called The Strange Cases of Sherlock.com.
All right. Thank you so much for that. Well, Timothy, we've talked about a variety of things today, but is there anything that we haven't covered that you would like to bring up or highlight at this point?
No, I think we've covered most of it. I mean, okay. I could talk about my next book and the book after that and the book after that, but
yeah. Well, it's good that you have, that you've got plenty of things that are waiting for you to write.
Oh yes, I've got to get this thing finished up for my editor, who's been waiting for it patiently, and hopefully we'll see another book out next year.
All right, wonderful. Well, I want to say thank you so much for taking time out of your day to talk to me about the newest novel, The Strange Case of the Dutch Painter, but also the other two that are in that series, as well as some of the other writings. I just really appreciate your time.
Well, thank you. I really appreciate it.
Thank you to Timothy for joining me to talk about The Strange Case of the Dutch Painter, The Strange Case of Eliza Doolittle, research, Sherlock Holmes, etc. Like I said, when I was going to one of the breaks, I am now going to listen to some of the Sherlock Holmes books, because as I was reading this book, I realized I know Sherlock Holmes kind of, through movies and through just, everything that you kind of know through osmosis about a character that is as famous as Sherlock Holmes, but I have not actually read the books. I think I've read bits and pieces. And so I don't know, is this depiction of Sherlock Holmes accurate? I'm going to assume it is, just from the interview and talking with Timothy, but I didn't have my own image of Sherlock Holmes, besides Robert Downey Jr. maybe, or something from PBS, to compare it to. So, yeah, I'm going to be listening to those, and I'll let you know what I think. But thank you to Timothy for talking to me and also encouraging me to add to my list of classics that I have not read. I've read a lot of classics. I have not read a lot of classics. Still working on it. Hope you enjoyed this interview. I hope that you will join me next time when I will be speaking with author Veronica Gutierrez about her book, As You Look. It is a Yolanda Avila mystery, so join me for that. We're going from historical mystery to contemporary mystery. That's always fun. As always, if you are a fan of this podcast, please do leave a review, written, starred, etc. Follow us on social media, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok. Like, subscribe, do all those wonderful things so you get episodes when they come out. If you haven't already done these things, I would appreciate it, as I appreciate you, all of you, the listeners who make this podcast possible. And by doing all of those things, you help to get the podcast out to more people who also love books. So thank you in advance for any of those things that you might do. Hope, as I said before, that you are having a great week. I hope it continues to be great, but regardless, I hope that the week involves lots and lots of time to get yourself lost in lots and lots of good books. Thank you.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Book Review Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network, from movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.